I used to take the commuter train to go to school. I went to a private school, and it was a bit far away from my home. Because of this, I'd walk down to the train station every day and take that on my way to school. I also had to take it on the way home, and then walk the rest of the way once I arrived at the station. School was over at around 3 p.m., and the school was thankfully located nearby the train station. I generally always enjoyed the ride home more so than the morning ride. In the morning, the train was always packed with people. I figured the majority of them were probably off going to work, but since I got off school long before rush hour time, plus the fact there were not many other students taking this particular train, it was usually largely empty on the way back. For the ride home, very often I would have the entire car all to myself. On this day, I was riding the train home from school as usual. I got on the train and found the car completely empty. The train cars themselves had these doors between them, which allowed passengers to move between the cars when the train was stationary. Although some brave passengers would go in between when the train was still moving, I'd never done so before myself. It looked so scary and precarious to walk between the cars while they were still in motion. Well, on this day, I was reading from my textbook when I heard one of the doors open very suddenly. Looking up, I immediately wished I hadn't. Standing there was a kid from my school who always bullied me. I'd never seen him on the train before, so I wondered why he was even here. I gulped and jerked my head down real quick, hoping he would not have seen me. Unfortunately, it seemed he had. He walked up to me and stood in the aisle right by my seat. I could feel him glaring at me as I kept praying that a conductor would come along soon. I didn't dare to meet his glare. I just kept looking down at my book. He then reached out with his hand underneath and slapped my book up into my face. This caused the book to fly up and hit me right in the nose before falling back down to the floor. Before I could say anything or even grab my book back up, he grabbed me and put me into a headlock. I struggled against him, but he was way too strong for me. He roughly pulled me over to the door between the cars. My stomach went cold when I thought about what he might do to me now. Opening the door, he put his foot in the way to prevent it from closing once again. He then took me and tried to push me down in between the cars. He was way stronger than me and easily pulled me across. Scared for my life though, I was able to muster up enough resistance in order to keep him from pushing me out any further. I guess there was also the argument in my mind that maybe he really wasn't trying to hurt me per se. Maybe he was just trying to scare me, so he wasn't using all of his strength. Regardless, I was completely terrified and bawling my eyes out. He was calling me names and laughing at me, all the while trying to push me into the space between the moving cars. He succeeded and pushed me closer to that space. Fortunately, you could just about stand on the very end of the car and not fall down in between. I wasn't completely in the danger zone yet. Then though, he began to punch me in the stomach multiple times. After a few torturous minutes of beating, finally a conductor rushed into the car from the other side. He screamed at the bully, ran over to him, and pulled him off of me. He then pulled me out from between the cars, and I collapsed onto the floor. Fortunately, the conductor was much bigger than my bully and was able to hold on to him and keep him from attacking me any further. This is the positive part of the story. The train stopped at the next stop, but the conductor did not open the doors right away. Instead, they made an announcement that the train would be delayed because of an incident. What they'd done was call the police and kept my bully from leaving the train until they arrived. Seeing that kid handcuffed and escorted off the train and into a police car was one of the most satisfying experiences of my young life. Looking back, I'm not sure I can say how much danger I was really in. I don't really know if I would have been able to fall between the cars if my bully wanted me to, but at that age, it was really terrifying. My friend Josh and I were hanging out one day. I think we were about 13 years old at the time. I remember this happening in late fall, because there were still a lot of leaves falling down from the trees. We had hopped a fence and followed some train tracks which went through a local forest. We liked walking on the rails and pretending we were tightrope walkers. Yeah, I know that sounds pretty lame, but we enjoyed it, even though we weren't supposed to play on the train tracks. We were absolutely safe though. I mean, there's no way we wouldn't know exactly when a train was coming. It would surely be loud, and we'd see it from far away as well. The forested area was not so thickened with trees that you couldn't see far down the tracks. We'd been hanging out, balancing and talking for a while, when we saw someone who was also walking on the tracks. He was a bit off in the distance and seemed to be walking towards us. I couldn't exactly tell how old he was, but we figured he was probably a teenager, probably a few years older than both me and Josh were. He was wearing jeans and a hoodie, and he had his hood up over his head. His hands were hidden in the front pocket of his hoodie, and he was looking down as he walked right in the middle of the train tracks. Now this really wasn't unusual on its own. We'd seen other people walking by the tracks while we were out before. It was probably just someone who wanted to be alone, or maybe someone who was out for a walk, and the train tracks were the best way to find their way back. Anyhow, the guy was still a bit away from us now. It was then, though, that we heard it. There was a train coming, and we heard it approaching from behind us. Josh and I looked back, seeing the train was at a very safe distance away behind us still. And the two of us jumped off the rail, and we walked a couple of yards away from the tracks. So the sound wouldn't deafen us. We looked over at the guy who was still walking towards us, but he didn't get off the track, or react at all even. I recall feeling very uneasy in that moment. Josh thought it was just a guy that was going to play a game of chicken with the train. That was an activity I'd always thought was dumb as hell. I screamed at the man that a train was coming, which in a way seemed somewhat pointless. There was no way he didn't hear the train, but he still didn't move at all. He just kept walking forward in the middle of the track, right in the direction of the train. As the train quickly passed us by, I began to run forward a bit. I was really scared that this guy wasn't moving at all. I screamed at him more, but there was no way he could even hear me over the sound of the train approaching now. The rest happened so fast that my brain had trouble processing it. It was like time slowed down as the guy looked up and directly into my eyes. I kept expecting him to jump out of the way of the train at the last minute, like it was some sort of action movie, but instead, the train hit him dead on, right in front of my eyes. He didn't even try to move. I immediately collapsed on the ground and started vomiting. Josh did too. I won't describe what we saw in full detail. It's too awful to even remember. The train stopped, of course. The policemen and the fire department rushed in as well. We waited there in case they needed to talk to us. Came to find out later that the guy was a student at a nearby high school. He left a suicide note to his parents and let the train hit him dead on. Words can never describe how awful that experience was. I had nightmares about it for years afterward. Often in those very same nightmares, I would once again see him looking into my eyes. I would always feel his blood splashing over me, covering me completely, and then I would wake up screaming. This story is told from a woman's perspective. I work in the city and live out in the suburbs. To avoid traffic, I take the commuter train to and from work. It's economical, it saves time, and it's generally a pretty stress-free way of traveling. I say generally because once I had a very awful experience riding home from work. And to set the scene a little bit, this happened in the winter, so the sun was already down when I got off work at 5 p.m. In addition, it was snowing as well. I made it to the train station, only to find it was extremely crowded. I had to push my way onto the train and try to find a good seat. The cars were pretty filled up to the brim already, so I ended up sitting in the only open spot in the entire car. It was a bench seat, situated right next to this pretty big guy. When you ride trains, you get used to having to sit next to people, But even so, you can sometimes sit next to somebody who makes you feel really uncomfortable right away. This is what happened in this case. The man I was sitting next to was pretty damn huge, and he made me feel very uneasy. Even though the trains were crowded, the bench seats were still big enough to allow space between the two passengers sitting on them. This guy, though, kept on trying to press up against me. I kept my earbuds in order to keep him from trying to talk to me, but he was obviously not keeping to his side of the seat. As much as I tried to just ignore him, he made the entire ride extremely nerve-wracking for me. Several times even, I just wanted to get up and walk away, but the train was too crowded to even move. There were passengers standing in the aisle, and there wasn't any room at all. I did try to consider that perhaps he might not have been trying to do this on purpose. Maybe he didn't notice it happening. After all, he didn't have a lot of room either. The stop where I was supposed to get off at would soon arrive. I realized I'd have to get up then in order to make it out. As soon as we stopped, I hopped up and tried to force myself through the crowd of people. I made my way out to the doors as everyone began to leave, and I got off myself as well. With a bit of shock, I noticed that the man had also gotten off out of the doors from the next car down. There were a lot of people getting off at that particular stop, but then I noticed him staring directly at me. As he kept looking, he lit up a cigarette and just stood by the train station, watching me as I walked away. Most of the other passengers got into their cars and drove off. I was stuck walking the rest of the way home, though. I kept looking back over my shoulder, and for the longest time, he just stood there smoking his cigarette and watching me. Soon, the crowd dispersed, however. As soon as they did, he crushed out his cigarette and began to walk in my direction. He was moving very fast now. I sped up myself, now really worried. I checked back over my shoulder and was scared to see the man was now sprinting after me. I had no idea what he intended, but I knew this could be no good. The next part is pretty blurry. He must have caught up with me at some point, because I remember him tackling me. I recall getting hit and falling down to the sidewalk. I hit my head on the side of the curb and completely blacked out. Next thing I knew, I woke up in the hospital with a concussion and quite a few lacerations. They said the guy had a knife on him, and he'd cut open my shirt pretty badly. He had run off, though, when a couple of senior citizens who were out taking a walk saw him in the middle of attacking me. They called the ambulance for me. The police never found the guy in the end either. We had no idea what he really intended, but I guess I could have guessed. Since the man was never caught, I was scared to death for the longest time. Whenever I went to work, whenever I walked down the street, whenever I rode the train, I was terrified of the smallest things. It took me a long time to be able to recover from that experience. This happened when I was 15, near Algonquin Park. My father and I were driving up to our cottage in the middle of winter. I always was so amazed at the beauty of the area and Muskoka, and had grown up enjoying the beauty of it every summer. Our cottage was on a large lake, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. There were probably thousands of cottages out on that lake. During summer, the lake and the town's population tripled. It was cottage country, so people would spend all summer enjoying the lake and warm nights around campfires with their family and friends. I spent pretty much every summer there growing up, and it still brings fond memories of sunshine and laughter and the sounds of motorboats out on the lake. But the winters were very different. The people that didn't live there all year round would venture back home to the city life, leaving the area almost completely deserted, with the cottages all boarded up for the winter. There were a few people who would still frequently come up every couple of months for a few days or so, but for the most part the lake was completely silent during the winters, and the town was only filled with locals. The beautiful pine trees were always covered in snow, making an eerie ambiance. Our cottage was situated on a dead-end road. There were about 20 other cottages on that road, with ours being somewhat right in the middle. The cottages were quite spaced out, however, with our closest neighbors being too far away to even see through the trees. My dad had needed to head up there to do some painting that my mom had been bugging him to do. It was at the end of February, and it was a long weekend. I tagged along so he wouldn't be alone, and we could spend some quality time together. It was about a 5-hour drive, but it turned out to be an 8-hour drive this time due to the heavy snow. It had gotten dark out quite early, and it was around midnight as we drove through the park. It was deadly quiet and pitch black except for the headlights of our car. We finally passed through with only about 30 minutes left to arrive to our destination. It had finally stopped snowing, and we were both just eager to get there. As we turned down a familiar road, I remember my dad cursing a storm. It hadn't been plowed yet. This wasn't surprising, however. It probably wouldn't even be until later the next day that we would even see a snowplow. As we drove down the snowy road, we noticed there seemed to be a fresh set of tire tracks. "The Smiths must be up for the weekend," my dad said. All of a sudden, though, as we drove around the bend following the tire tracks, the headlights of the car shone on a white van that was parked on the side of the road. It was almost completely hidden by the vast trees that were covered in snow, hiding in the darkness. "What the?" my dad mumbled. As we drove past this van, I remember looking back through the back window and very clearly seeing two figures in the front seat, illuminated by our retreating taillights. As I told my dad this, he simply shrugged. "I don't know, maybe they're lost or something." I nodded, but I couldn't help but think about how this was a dead-end road, so why would they feel the need to park there of all places? As we pulled into our driveway and started bringing in all our stuff, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right here. I couldn't stop thinking about that van. Why was it there with two people just sitting in the dark in the middle of a snowing night? It spooked me so much that I begged my dad to let me sleep upstairs with him. I didn't want to sleep alone downstairs in the room my sister and I usually shared. It had big windows with no blinds that looked out into the blackness of the forest. My 15-year-old self was already scared enough of the dark. I didn't need to see the white van creeping around. It wasn't a big deal when my sister was there, but not alone, and not tonight. As my dad got ready for bed, I sat in the living room reading a book. My dad had turned all the lights off already, so I was using a small lamp next to the couch to try and get through one last chapter before bed. It was so quiet I could almost hear my own ears ringing. Suddenly, I started to get the feeling that I was now being watched. The living room also had large windows with no curtains that overlooked the lake. It was completely black outside, except for a single light from some cottages across the lake. I shut off the lamp and got up. Now, the cottage was completely dark. The moon was shining brightly, illuminating the snow. It was quite a beautiful sight, actually. I walked toward the window a bit to get a better look. As I did so, movement caught the corner of my eye. I remember my heart dropping as I saw two figures down by the back porch, crouched below the window, barely hidden by the surrounding trees. I dropped to the floor and crawled toward the bedroom where my dad was sleeping, my heart in my throat. I couldn't be sure if they had seen me or not. I hurriedly woke my dad up, and by the time he got to the window, the two figures were long gone. Where I had seen the figures, though, were two sets of footprints in the snow, which led back around to the front of the cottage and back down the driveway. I begged my dad not to go outside. He double-checked the locks and turned on the porch lights, hopefully to scare the intruders off. My dad wasn't as freaked out as I was, but he still set the alarm before he headed back to bed. I was extremely freaked out, though. I lay there all night next to my dad, terrified I'd look out the window and see someone staring back at me. The next morning, we went outside and confirmed there were two sets of footprints leading from the road to behind our cottage, then back around to the front and back up the road. There were also tire marks that showed a vehicle had turned around and then gone back up to the main road. My dad guessed they were probably looking to break in and steal stuff, as it was in the middle of winter and not too many people were at the lake. Thing is, though, these guys knew we were there. They would have seen our tire tracks leading up to the cottage and my dad's car parked up front. They would also have seen the lamp I'd turned on to read, or at least seen it go off. My dad didn't have an answer to that, and after much back and forth, he called the non-emergency line and reported it. Apparently, there had been some break-ins in the area, and some stuff had been stolen from some cottages that were boarded up for the winter. I still wonder to this day, though, why would they be interested in stealing from the only house that clearly had people still inside it? Background: I'm 24 and female, and live with a roommate who's 23 and female, in an apartment in the suburbs of ATL. As you may well know, ATL is super dangerous and crime-riddled right now, so we have a Ring People camera, perfect for apartments, and a digital lock on our door for safety. Now on to the actual story. About 3 months ago, this really sweet family from across the hall moved out, and we got ourselves a new neighbor. His name is David, and let's just say he's quite interesting. When we first saw him moving in, we were a bit taken aback by the sheer amount of stuff he was trying to shove into his one-bedroom apartment. All of it was anime merch and Star Wars memorabilia. Definitely gave me some hoarder vibes. But that's none of my business. When the moving trucks left and a few days had passed by, my roommate and I knocked on his door to give him a friendly welcome to the neighborhood gift basket with some baked goods, dog treats, and poop bags for his dog. There were some scented seasonal candles as well. Apparently, that was not the correct thing to do though. After that day, David started to get creepy. It started out innocent enough. He would come to the door whenever he heard me or my roommate coming or going and have a quick, casual chat. He would also come over regularly to ask for salt or sugar or toilet paper or whatever. Sometimes he would ask if we could come over and watch his dog for a bit. But within the past 2 weeks, things really began to escalate. 2 weeks ago, we were out pretty late partying at the bars near the Braves Stadium. We ended up getting home around 3 a.m., only to find David sitting at the top of the stairs waiting for us. He acted all upset, asked us where we'd been, and requested we tell him if we're planning to be out past midnight. I laughed in his face, and he called me a mindless Stacy. Still not sure what that means exactly. He asked for access to our Ring camera so we could make sure we were safe. We laughed at him again and went into our apartment. Here's the scary part though. When we checked the camera the next morning, we saw that he sat outside our apartment the entire time in front of our door for the rest of the night. When we saw that, we contacted the complex to let them know he was acting crazy. And they told us to contact the police, so we did just that. The police told us to contact them if he made any threats, but since we lived in a shared space, they couldn't do anything until he entered our apartment or threatened us in some way. I assume the complex said something to him at least, because he left us alone for the next 5 days or so. The next week, he really got out of control though, constantly lurking outside our apartment. My roommate had to start leaving for work an hour earlier just to not cross paths with him. I can't leave the apartment during the day because he's constantly just standing outside waiting for me. He leaves love letters on our door, on our cars, in our mailbox. Once, when I told him I wasn't interested, he told me he would kill me and then himself if I didn't go on a date with him. Of course, I didn't get that down in writing, so the police decided not to do shit. He put up a Ring doorbell of his own too, so we could track all of our movements. He'll leave these really creepy sexual notes when we're gone, and we'll find them in the most random places when we come back too. We just don't know what to do.